योगः कर्मसु कौशलम्.
At the outset, I, Dr. Shampa Dev, would like to thank the UGC Human Resource Development Center of Gujarat University and especially Dr. Jagdish Joshi, Professor and Director of UGC HRDC of Gujarat University, for providing me with an opportunity to connect with you and deliver my session on the existence of right to property under international law. It is noteworthy that the MHRD has funded the UGC HRDC of Gujarat University for over 3 crores under Rashtriya Uchchatar Shikshan Abhiyan grant. It is one of the very few HRDCs which has successfully organized numerous programs under it. It has collaborated with prestigious institutes like the IIMA, SPIPA, IIT Delhi and Mumbai, JNU, Delhi University, the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, Mussoorie, Mumbai University, Narsi Monji Institute of Management, InflibNet, SNDT Mumbai University, St. Xavier's College Mumbai, NIPA, NCERT, and the UGC. I would also like to put on record my sincere appreciation for Dr. Bhavesh Bharat and his team for so meticulously planning and coordinating this refreshed course in law. I deem it my privilege to be a part of this online course in law. My session today is on the existence of right to property under international law. As a faculty teaching jurisprudence, legal philosophy, research, and with a huge interest in international law, it has often crossed our discussions in classroom, particularly while teaching the concept of possession, ownership, and property, about the various new events that are happening around us, the news that used to come in, particularly with respect to news wherein people buying stars or parts or a territory on the moon and receiving certificate for that. And classroom discussions would always revolve around what's the validity of the title deed that they are procuring in that manner. Will they ever get a real right to property with respect to a piece of land on the moon? This question kept on coming up again and again. Not just that, the emergence of cryptocurrencies, also with respect to deep seabed minerals. This question always came up about what would be property under international law, because these seem to be beyond the boundaries of states. By state here, I mean, as for example, India, China, Pakistan, US, UK, and the like. In contrast, there are a lot of authors who use the word nations. Mostly political science authors use the word state. I'm here for convenience referring to all these nations as states. So generally what we see is property law is the sole domain of states with respect to their own territory. In international law, we hardly ever read an international law relating to property. But of course, territory on the moon or buying, say, certain stars in your name or deep sea bed minerals, these of course go beyond the purview of state jurisdiction. So a quick search on what falls under international property law surprisingly did not reveal much, data on that. A further search on that, I found there was a book written in 2006 by Otis Franklin and a few articles after that by him, and very few mention of the term property. But what I found was that there were instances of property in international law, but in most cases, they weren't referred to as property law under international law. They fell under, say, for example, laws of war or different other laws, say intellectual property, but never referred to as property. And that prompted more inquisitiveness into the subject. Before we launch on to what we to the session to the actual session, let me just quickly take you through the learning objectives. To understand the challenges of designating international property law as a separate subject, to investigate into the existing laws to see the traces of international property law, and to know the rationale of the strategies adopted for better regulation of the global commons. The proposed learning outcomes: at the end of the session, participants will be able to trace the evolution of international property law. They'll be able to explain the sources of international property law, analyze various strands of international property law for its bindingness, scope, and applicability. They'll be able to evaluate the rationale and the principles underlying various treaties on the subject. They'll be also able to suggest ways of dealing with the challenges of enforcement faced by international property law. So the scheme of my presentation today, the sessions are divided into three main parts. One is about examining the antecedents of international property law, and that's the first part, discussing the evolution of international property law. If at all, we may call it an international property law. Part two of this presentation would explore the thesis that four modern sources have created a robust body of international property law. Now, these four sources, primarily dealing with global commons, transboundary movement property rights, or laws trying to prevent certain specific harms or the protection of human rights, these are the sources of international property law. And it is from these areas that we have a huge bulk of international property law. The last part of the presentation would deal with the challenges posed, if at all we explore the challenges that arise from the emergence of an international property law. The challenges with respect to defining property, the challenges with respect to the scope, and of course, enforcement being international property law. So moving to the first part, and that's evolution of international property law. Property law generally has been historically seen as created and defined by national laws. So given the territory of India, India has the state has the power to regulate the property rights of its citizens with respect to all property that is there within its territory. So it could be tangible, movable property. It could be immovable property. The state gets the right to regulate those subject matters. Not surprisingly, it comes from this maxim, the quid quem est in territorio est etiam de territorio. All individuals and all property within the territory of a state are under its dominion and its sway. So the state has the first right to regulate property matters or property rights of its citizens or individuals within the territory of the property line within the territory of their jurisdiction. Looking at this right of the state, when it regulates the territory, when it regulates the property rights, what does it do? It actually defines how title may be acquired with respect to the ownership of property. Matters pertaining to the ownership of property of every kind. By every kind, I mean it could be movable, immovable, tangible, intangible sorts of property. So it defines how title may be acquired with respect to that property. It also talks about how the title can be retained and transferred. It talks about rights, duties, privileges, and powers a person may have with respect to his property. And all of these are jurisprudential concepts, the rights, duties, privileges, and powers that a person enjoys with respect to the property, which property law generally governs. Now, for further reading, I have suggested a few books over here. There are many more other books as well, but Oppenheim's International Law and Ian Brownlee Principles of Public International Law are the major books with respect to international law. So far as the relationship between the state and citizens with respect to property is concerned, it seems to be like a vertical relation. The state regulates the property rights of its citizens. Just Jeremy Bentham has observed in this book, The Theory of Legislation, that property and law are born together, they die together. Before laws were made, there was no property, and take away laws, property ceases. Of course, we've read this before. Possession is a pre-legal concept. Even before the law comes in, there was this concept of possession, people occupying land, cultivating it, working on it, claiming it to be theirs. But it is the ownership and property ideas came in only with the creation of the state. So the laws defined what ownership would be or with respect to what kind of property. So property and law go hand in hand. They are born together, they die together. Take away property, take away laws, property ceases. In contrast, if we see public international law, I say public international law because generally it's public law and it governs interaction amongst states. So it depicts a horizontal relationship between states as opposed to the relationship that we found in the previous slide, the vertical relation between the state and its citizens with respect to property. If you look at if you peruse international law, we do come across diplomats' property, and we read it under customary international law. We also come across wartime seizure of property, which is generally read under the laws of war. So it's not mentioned that it's an international property law. Property is regulated under international law, but they fall under different heads. With the decolonization, newly independent nations were reluctant to permit international review of their efforts towards nationalizing foreign owned property. And it became even more difficult to create property rights in international law. One interesting anecdote, just I would like you all to read up more on Guano Islands Act, wherein the United States in around 1856, the law, this is the law which I have pasted over here, a PDF file written in hand during the time that's 1855, came into force in 1856, wherein the US Congress authorized its people that if they find any island which is not occupied by any other state and which has huge deposits of guano over there, they would annex it to the US. And not just that, in this manner, the United States made approximately around 100 islands as a part of the United States. And it gave an incentive to people to go in search for islands that had guano deposits in it. Now, efforts for a global right to property started more in the aftermath of the World War II. And if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that's substantive law, but primarily it's a non-binding moral values. It talks about a right to property under Article 17. The wording goes that everyone has a right to own property alone and as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. But when the question of formulating binding principles in the form of covenants, that is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights came up for discussion, there was not much agreement on the implementation of in a binding form this right to property. So the culmination from the substantive law to binding principles did not really happen. In fact, efforts were made, and since there was a lot of disagreement on the provision, what the UN did was they made it into small 5 different units, and it was individually passed. But when it was all put together and put to vote, it did not pass the vote. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, once again, this effort about recognizing an international property law came up, and the importance of having an international property law came up. And and the efforts of the Commission on Human Rights led to the appointment of a Rodrigues Committee. This committee, headed by a noted scholar, Rodrigues, was asked to consider how a right to own property would be able to contribute to the development of individual liberty and initiative, in individual initiative. But by the time the Rodrigues report came in around 1993, it was found that the finding was that it is extremely difficult to establish a universal human right to individual private property in terms that one can substantiate requiring incorporation in the national law. Because all states, even if you look today, all states have different viewpoints on how property would be regulated. But if you look at, in contrast, Europe had developed a sizable body of supranational property law. But over the years, the ideological oppositions that were depicted by China and the USSR started fading. In fact, there was the collapse of USSR and the end of the Mao Zedong regime in China. China later in 2004 even introduced an inviolable right to property by making an amendment in the constitution. There was this already in existence an international intellectual property law. Now, that is, of course, a part and parcel of property law, raising questions about what are the subdivisions of international property law may be existing. If intellectual property is one subdivision, there might be many other subdivisions which are existing but not known to be as a separate property law. So states often serve as agents of international bodies and as their principals. So over the years, what we found was that international law, which was generally regulating relationship between states inter se, a new subject also developed, and they were states, not just states, non-state actors, businesses, individuals having intellectual property rights also became direct subjects of international law. Now, we once again come to a situation wherein it looks like presently that there is international law and there is a vertical relation, international law on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's not alone states amongst each other, it's about states, non-state actors, businesses, individuals. So what we have today majorly is international law on the one hand, and on the other hand, citizens represented through their own states. How does international law create, restrict, and regulate property? International law creates property rights either expressly or impliedly. It provides mechanisms to coordinate property rights created at the national level. And it also defines and restricts the scope of property rights which may be created at the national level. And this is what we are going to see. The examples of these are we'll be discussing in the next session, the Kyoto Protocol and the Empower State, wherein the states are empowered to allow their citizens to trade in international law and others. So 4 major factors that have fostered the growth of international property law: the technology rise. Technology increasingly permits humans to exploit resources in the global commons. The more it is becoming feasible to exploit resources in earlier either to territories that were beyond our reach, it is necessary now since technology has increased and has facilitated exploring of resources in the global commons, we do need an international property law. One result of globalization is that property rights and their owners increasingly, span national borders. And when the person himself moves, whether property rights move with him and how it is. Technology facilitates the existence of property in the virtual world itself. If you look at copyrights or cryptocurrencies, they exist in the virtual world beyond the reach of the states. In certain situations, for common good of all nations also require that some constraints be put on the states with respect to how they regulate property rights in their own areas. For example, whether the endangered species get protected, and also a broad human right to property, which is still an aspiration, a narrow vision of this version of this right, is recognized in some contexts, such as the rights of aboriginal lands and the property rights of the refugees. So we stop here for the first session. For the next session, we will move on to the sources of international property law. Welcome back once again to part 2 of which deals with the 4 sources of international property law. The thesis that this part is presenting is that there is an international property law, and these are the 4 sources of this international property law. It arises from the regulation of global commons. The next bunch of sources arises from coordination of transboundary property rights. The third bunch of international property law arises from the adoption of global policies to protect against specific harms. And the fourth bunch of property laws arise in the protection of human rights. We will be exploring each of these and all the subheadings under that in the next few slides. So the first part deals with the regulation of global commons. And in the regulation of global commons, we are going to generally talk about the general prohibition of property rights in the global commons. The rights in deep sea bed minerals as an exception, tradable emission allowances, and also rights in geostationary satellites. So this is broadly the first part, that's regulation of global commons. Generally, there is a prohibition of property rights in the global commons by definition, because these are outside the jurisdictions of various states. By virtue of that, by definition itself, since they are outside the territorial jurisdiction of states, the states cannot exercise property rights in those areas. Now, the examples of these are outer space, the moon, the high seas, celestial bodies, the high seas beyond 200 nautical miles into the sea, Antarctica. These are areas which are outside the purview of states' national jurisdictions. So they cannot establish sovereignty rights, or juridical persons cannot appropriate resources from these that are beyond their jurisdictions. Now, if the states do not have property rights in these, then are they absolutely not regulated? Who do they belong to? It is generally known to all of us that these are the global commons. The rights with respect to that are vested in mankind as a whole. The following, for further reading, I have given over here the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, the Treaty on Principles Governing Activities of the State in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, the Antarctic Treaty. We do have all of these treaties with respect to the global commons. And we are going to explore what, very briefly and summarily, the property rights with respect to these group of things, particularly the ones that are in the global commons. The Outer Space Treaty, which include outer space including the moon and other bodies, it is the province of all mankind, is what the Outer Space Treaty clearly lays out. It is therefore not subject to national appropriation by claims of sovereignty or by means of use or occupation or by any other means. So, states cannot create property rights by saying that I'm the first person to explore the moon and I go and put my flag over there. By virtue of that, it becomes mine. It cannot become any state's. The Outer Space Treaty is very clearly mentioning that. So the appropriation by claims of sovereignty or by means of use or occupation. By occupation also, we are not allowed to claim space or a territory or jurisdiction or sovereignty over any of these outer space bodies. No nation may recognize property rights in outer space. The Moon Treaty is far more specific. The Moon Treaty applies to the moon as well as to other celestial bodies within the solar system other than the Earth. So it very clearly states that it is not just the state, it is also that intergovernmental or non-governmental organizations, national organization, or any non-governmental entity or any natural person, no one can be allowed to claim property rights with respect to moon and other celestial bodies. Very interestingly, just go through the Space Act 2015 passed by the United States and what is the scope of that act. Recently, you may have come across Jeff Bezos' trip to space. He was the second person, but so far as the first, as compared to the first person, Jeff Bezos and his flight took him beyond the Kármán line, that is where the atmosphere ends and outer space begins, where a person will be able to experience weightlessness. So they crossed the Kármán line into the outer space. Now, the points to ponder over here is the law only restricting exploration, claiming sovereignty or territorial rights with respect to outer space? Or does it also prohibit space tourism when it says that harmful contamination is not allowed? So leaving of debris or pollution into the outer space, is that also restricted? That's for you to ponder, where I go ahead with the next is the rights in deep seabed minerals. As I was telling you just now in the previous slide, that we do not have a right to property in all of these outer space. There is an exception to that. And as an exception is the deep seabed minerals created under the United Nations, the law of the sea. And further in part 11 of, that is in the 1994 agreement, there were certain rights created. It established an authority to create and regulate property rights so far as manganese, copper, nickel, and any other minerals of value that is found in the deep sea. So there is an authority, and it is this authority that creates and regulates property rights in deep seabed minerals. So deep seabed exploration has been made possible to a certain extent. Any person or entity from any nation which has ratified the UNCLOS has been empowered to make applications. So applicant must meet certain specific criteria with respect to financial and technological criteria. And this applicant must be sponsored by the state. Another applicant has been, this application, if the state is sponsoring an applicant who meets the financial and technological criteria, this application would generally be accepted, except for when another applicant has also been granted a right, then this application may get rejected. Or proposed mining would bring serious harm to the marine environment, then the application might get rejected. Or where the applicant's nation has sponsored an inordinate amount of mining, that is greater than 2%. If that has been done, the application will get rejected. It also says that the title to the minerals that is recovered by deep seabed mining, upon recovery, will pass, the title to it will pass in accordance with this particular convention. So there are some restrictions with respect to it that has been brought about. Another group of things that falls under the global commons is tradable emission allowances. You may all have heard about certified emission reductions and emission reduction units, the Kyoto Protocol, that created a carbon trading mechanism empowering the states to allow its citizens to trade in emission reduction units or to trade in certified emission reductions. Emission reduction units stem from investments that a private individual or a company may make to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So all the investments will get converted into the investment that he makes for reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. That investment gets converted into emission reduction units, and he has been given the right to trade in those emission reduction units. This is particularly for developed nations. So far as developing nations are concerned, there are certified emission reductions. These are given in the form of credits, and these credits can be sold or traded on. Okay. Now, what are certified emission reductions? These are certified credits in developing countries that reduce emissions as authorized by the Clean Development Mechanism. So where a certain company has invested in clean development mechanism, he is entitled to certain credits. Now, he has to put it up across on the UNFCCC website, and there will be objections that are invited, and eventually his application, once it gets passed, he would be given certain credits. He can sell those credits to the developed nations or beyond his own state. Rights in geostationary satellite orbits. Now, we all know what geostationary satellite orbits are above the equator. And now these are long-term leases to use an orbit for 50 years only, and to exclude others from such use and to transfer that right. Now, geostationary satellites are very useful, as we all know, valuable for communications, weather, for navigation as well. Now, this allocation of a certain orbit to a certain state is basically a long-term lease that is granted for a period of 15 years. So it's a right or a property right which is created in the state or which is granted in the form of a lease. So the implication is this, that the first state that applies, so it's akin to the first come, first served basis, a prior right in the law. Now, this right is allocated by an international authority, that's the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, wherein the states will have to apply for launching their satellites and for that particular lease for a space over there. So we see that these satellites are launched around 36,000 kilometers above the equator. But there is a restriction that there are only 2,000 permissions that can be granted. And because there is a restriction over there, the whole process is now regulated by the International Telecommunications Union. For further reading, you can refer to this that's given under. The next group of sources of international law is generally found in the coordination of transboundary property rights. And this coordination for transboundary property rights arises in situations that are given under the four heads over here: rights in equipment crossing national borders, rights to compensation for expropriation, intellectual property, and owners who cross national borders. So it may be equipments that, with respect to equipment that cross national border, it could be with respect to people who cross national border, intellectual property, and when foreign property is expropriated by the state, then there are certain norms with respect to it. And that's where we are talking about sources of international property law. So the first one, rights and equipment that cross national borders, primarily deal with aircrafts, trains, or even spacecrafts that the creditors have a security interest in these mobile equipment. When they leave one state and go into another state, say supposing a war breaks out, and this is and the aircraft or the train say is stopped over there, there are creditors who have security interests in these. Now, international law recognizes an international interest in favor of the security interests of the creditors. So all members of this nation, all member nations honor this international interest of what? The security interests that creditors have in these mobile equipment. So there is a registry that has been created, and that is the Electronic International Registry, that once this particular, say, an aircraft is registered in that, then all the protection would be extended to these. For further reading, you may refer to these conventions that have been given, which refer to these group of cases. Right to compensation for expropriation, where foreign nationals' property is to be expropriated or seized. What kind of compensation would be the correct compensation? What amount of compensation would be the right amount of compensation? Generally, the customary international law would regulate it and would say that it should be fair market value. Newly independent nations wanted to nationalize foreign property in their own states, and stated that the compensation would be as per national laws. They restricted international interference in during this the expropriation of foreign property and nationalizing foreign property within their state. After which, later, there are certain international norms that have come up. So the recent trend is more towards giving a fair compensation, as developing countries have also started seeking foreign investment. So it's not just when a developing country, or say a country acquires independence and wants to expropriate foreign property in its own land. At a later point of time, they want foreign investments also to come in. Then once again, the customary international law slowly crystallizing into what we call as a fair compensation or a fair market value. Intellectual property is, of course, quite a lot of it is online, particularly copyrights. Patents also work beyond boundaries. Trademarks and other forms of intellectual property, these are particularly vulnerable to piracy and other problems. So enforcement becomes difficult when national laws of different states differ. And because of which, we have seen patent cooperation treaty coming up. We have the Berne Convention on protection of literary and artistic works. We do have the 1994 agreement, or that's the TRIPS. There is a requirement of national treatment, a treatment no less favorable than that it accords to my own nationals. So that is international law with respect to international property. The basis of that law is noteworthy, which talks about treatment, national treatment. That is a treatment which is no less favorable than that it accords to its own national, that a state accords to its own nationals. Right of owners who cross national borders. Global standards have been created with respect to wills, interstate succession, estate administration, etc. Because nowadays we see people have properties in different territories all over the world. Not just that, they may have territories, they may have property in India, and they may have traveled to the US and settled there. Now, how do the international property law has developed to help these kind of people who move from country to country or state to state? So rights of owners who cross national border authorizes the creation of international will, which is valid in all member nations. The next source bunch of property laws come from the adoption of global policies to prevent specific harms. And this we will read under restrictions on import and export with respect to cultural objects, contraband, and transboundary impacts. So let's launch into that. Restrictions on import and export. To implement public policies endorsed by global community that there are certain endangered species and they must be protected, and they should not be hunted for say elephants for the tusks, or tigers for the tooth, or the skin, tiger skin, or with respect to hazardous waste. If at all one state is not able to dispose of its hazardous waste, it is allowed to send it to the other state for disposal, provided that the other state will manage the waste in an environmentally sound manner. So international law with respect to governing these kind of property, say it could be things like hazardous waste or endangered species, norms have come up with respect to that as well. So as a public policy which is endorsed by the global community, we do have the Basel Convention with respect to transboundary movement of hazardous waste. We do have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. If you see in Singapore that there is a lot of, since the problem with respect to this is, since if the implementation of it or the observance of it would be against the national self-interest, there are a lot of violations that come up and that poses as a challenge. Singapore particularly has a lot of these products selling, of course, as in a violation of this particular convention. Not just those kind of objects, there are also rights created in cultural objects. Cultural objects are basically, here you have a few examples, are basically objects which are of historical importance or of cultural importance of a certain state. Whether, and on many occasions, these are found in different states, not say Indian origin products that have, or objects that have historical value in India found somewhere in some other country. Now, these are basically stolen or exported. Owners of cultural objects are obligated under these laws that are given under the for further reading, that they are obligated to return it to their states of origin. And for that, they would be given fair and a reasonable compensation. There's also a book by Forrest on international law and protection of cultural heritage. There are laws in India as well restricting sale of cultural objects beyond the territory of India. Further, another bunch of laws evolved in rights and contraband articles. So contraband articles, particularly as you see over here, are the narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. These are contraband articles. States are required to establish a criminal offense under its domestic law. Now, this is what the international law directs a state to do, to make laws making possession, purchase, or even cultivation of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances for personal consumption or for the purpose of sale or distribution, or acquisition, possession, or use, knowing that it is for a criminal activity. So states are bound to make laws making these as criminal offenses. What is it? The possession, purchase, and cultivation, for circulating for the purpose of sale or distribution, or even acquiring contraband articles or having possession of it. States are required to adopt measures that allow the confiscation of drugs, substances, and equipment used in connection with illicit trafficking. So these are the two conventions. There are more that could be a part of this. The next is about transboundary impacts. Now, there is a case mentioned over here, the Trail Smelter arbitration decision. In this, what happened was in Canada, the Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company of Canada. It's a zinc smelter, and it released a lot of sulfur dioxide gas into the atmosphere. The prevalent winds carried it to the US and damaged private property in the US. It also results into acid rains. So this matter was taken to the court, and the arbitration decision held that under international law, an owner may not use its property in such a manner that damages property in another nation. Now, if you look at the draft principles under this, it calls on each state to adopt national laws that impose liability on persons within its territory whose hazardous activities cause significant transboundary damage to persons, property, or environment. So, uh, just calling your attention to the second line over there, damage to persons, property, or environment. So it's not just about releasing sulfur dioxide or any other poisonous gases into the atmosphere. It is about using your property in such a manner that it does not cause harm. Now, this is something that which we have also read under torts law. But then in international law, as under transboundary impact, I'm presenting over here that these kind of principles also exist. Now, bringing us to the question as to what about this? Supposing we start questioning, consider a case of virus leakage from a research institute within the boundaries of the state, outside the boundaries of the state. Would this principle, draft principles, be enforceable? How? What are the factual requirements? I mean, what all proofs would be required if at all we are to make a state liable? Whether we can at all make the state liable in international law, or is it just that the state will bind its own citizens towards these obligations, and there arises no actual obligation under the international law? What factors would affect the determination of liability under international law? Maybe you could keep thinking on that, and we move on to the next and the last, that's the protection of human rights. Under this head as well, there has evolved a bunch of international law which can be spoken under as property law. So prohibition of property rights in human beings, rights in aboriginal lands, avoid forced evictions, rights of refugees is what we'll discuss. Prohibition of property rights in human beings. As we all know, earlier slaves were considered to be property. Now they are not. So any international law that deals with that is actually touching upon property rights in human beings. And that is for one, we do have the Convention on to suppress the slave trade and slavery, a complete abolition of slavery. And then these are the other laws that also apply. If you look at the last one, that's in 2008, holding that the plaintiff was sold in slavery in violation of international law. So international law does talk about or prohibit property rights in human beings. So far as rights in aboriginal lands are concerned of indigenous people, international law does have a say in that as well. Indigenous people have a human right of ownership of the lands that their ancestors traditionally occupied. And states, and because by virtue of these international law, states are required to give legal recognition to the protection of such lands. For example, tribal lands wherein others cannot go and buy property. It's nothing but respecting the rights of the people, the indigenous people, with that and their relationship with that particular piece of land. It's not just that, it's not just about protecting the land, it's also about protection of biodiversity and traditional knowledge with respect to and what is owned by the rights by the aboriginal or the indigenous people. So these are the relevant further readings. Right to avoid forced evictions. The ICESCR in the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate housing. So we find that the ICESCR specifies clearly that forced evictions are prima facie incompatible with the requirements of the covenant. Evictions, if at all, should be only for, so these are the points given: general welfare, reasonable and proportional, and ensure that it gives full and fair compensation. Only if these three criteria are satisfied to a certain extent, then of persons, there may be evictions done. So eviction, if at all, it has to be only for general welfare, reasonable, it should be reasonable, it should be proportional, and it should ensure full and fair compensation. Rights of refugees and other displaced persons. Refugees and displaced persons do have rights and restored to them, and their right to have it restored to them any housing, land, or property of which they have been arbitrarily deprived. The relevant conventions are the Declaration of Human Rights, of course, it's there, as apart from the Pinheiro Principles adopted by the UN Commission on the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights. So it may be an involuntary displacement because of, say, an armed conflict or a forced eviction or due to natural disasters. The refugees do have these rights, and the states must respect these rights. So that's the end of the sources of international law, from where we can get, I mean, from all these slides that you've seen, on under all the 4 points, there were at least 4 heads wherein we saw that there is an international property law that is not recognized under the head international property law, but under various other laws. So we come to the end of that session. We'll join sometime later with the next part, the third part, that's challenges posed by international property law. Now we come to the third part, and that's the challenges posed by recognizing an international property law. If at all there is a subject called as international property law, what all things would be the challenges that this subject would have to take care of? And under that, we come across the value of the first discussion would be the value of recognizing an international property law towards an international definition of property. And the third part is about the enforcement problem. Looking at the value of recognizing international property law, not exactly a challenge over here, but the challenge, but though it may not be a challenge, it tries to point out the value of recognizing international property law. It talks about the instrumental value and the analytic value, and it raises a question as to for what reason do we want an international property law to be recognized. The instrumental value looks at it as a means to an end. And what is the end? For example, if there are forced evictions because of climate change, and we have to study it under international environmental law, you do not find a lot of law that has crystallized with respect to compensating or rehabilitation of persons displaced due to climate change. But it is a subject matter of study under international environment law. Also, it is also studied under international human rights law. But since there is no international property law, it does not get completely regulated because we require that the persons displaced need to be rehabilitated, and if at all compensation could be granted, we could settle those persons properly. So if we read the topic under international property law, it will help to deal with the subject matter better. So new situations arising out of globalization can also be tackled if we recognize an international property law. So it does have instrumental value. It is as a means to an end, and we are looking at the end of that. A better regulation would be possible if at all we have a subject called as an international property law. Apart from that, it also has its own analytic value. For example, as to look at it as an end in itself, have international property law as a subject for its own sake, because it's a subject as such, not because you want to give proper compensation and rehabilitation of people who've been evicted because of climate change. Not for that reason, but for the sole reason that international property law merits to be called as a subject matter on its own, of its own standing. It has a claim to its authority which rests on logic, order, and consistency. It will facilitate development of doctrines. It facilitates the development. The subject itself would facilitate development of doctrines and principles as under itself. Security interests in airplanes and trains would also be able to be extended to vessels. Harmonization promotes efficiency and thus fosters economic growth. So, not just for its instrumental value, maybe we need to discuss and find out which, for what reason, but more importantly, to understand that yes, it is a subject matter which, for its own sake, logic, order, and consistency, it needs taken to be studied, researched, and developed to its fullest extent. If at all we are to talk about an international property law, we would first fall into the problem of defining what property would be given and would be in an international property law. In fact, if we see, even in municipal law, there is not much of a definition of property that is given. At the most, what we see is a bunch of ownership rights, which we also learn under ownership. If you look at the municipal law, what we see over here is that property is, this is what movable property is, and these are the laws that deal with it. Or this is what immobile property is, and this is how you may acquire immovable property or may transfer, and all of that. So what would exactly be the content of property under international property law? We will talk about ownership as a bundle of rights. Basically, that deals with how you use it, how you exclude other people from interference, and also how you would dispose of that property. Look at the 1993 report on the UN Commission on Human Rights, which also talks about acquisition, management, administration, and disposition, which is very much similar to use, exclude, dispose of property. So if you look at the Western notion and traditional notions being different, it brings out challenges. Western notion wherein it defines that this is how you purchase property and this is how you become owner of property. Whereas in many other countries, in many other states, even today, what we see is there is no specific way of acquisition of property. All property belongs to the state, and people are occupying it, and the state regulates the whole of it. So there is a vast difference in how property and property ownership rights with respect to property are construed in the Western world and in as compared to many other traditional notions of property. So since there is no agreement on a common content, it will pose as a challenge. Many regions where property still has no title, it is basically mere occupation and providing for example, aboriginal lands, traditional forms of ownership is depicted in those type of systems. So there has to be a common system. When we say that there is an intellectual property law, it has to be able to define the content of it in one way and not have different ideas prevalent under it. So that's a unification that would be required to be done. What would be the scope of an international property law, if at all it's there? Are we only going to talk at no one shall be arbitrarily deprived? At what point does government action which harms private property cross the line of becoming non-compensable? Regulation to indirect expropriation that requires paying investors according to international standards. So that needs to be defined. The scope has to be clearly laid out so that we can have a clear international property law. Another challenge is about what are the things that the property law would regulate. Of course, we looked at tangibles, intangibles, but almost when we all know that, there is a broad agreement on what tangibles are and what particularly intangibles are: bank deposits, copyrights, debts, patents, shares. There is a disagreement in the margins, in the fringe areas. That is, whether market share of a business is property, whether welfare benefits or pensions are property, whether cryptocurrency is property. So there is a small disagreement with respect to things which are in the fringe areas, but majorly there is an agreement on what is tangible property and what is not, what intangible properties are there. Apart from that, there is another third challenge about the enforcement, which is not just true for an international property law. It's true with respect to any international law. But when we refer to it in terms of international property law, we do find a discussion about these topics that's there on the screen: reciprocity, national treatment, treaties, human values. These are the areas we'll be discussing. So far as the enforcement problem with respect to global commons are concerned, by definition, because it is outside state territory, it becomes very difficult to regulate, and it's out, and it's states will not regulate it. And if at all the global commons, that is the you say for example, international law has to deal with it, then then what is the international? There is no international executive or an enforcement machinery. If someone crosses the Karman line and goes out, if he causes if there is a pollution that has come up by virtue of that, which is the international mechanism that would take care of it? States are expected to ensure compliance by its nationals. But if the state themselves allow their nationals to explore, to research and develop, how, in the absence of an international mechanism, how can the whole thing be controlled? Enforcement problems are bound to increase because technology and technology growth allowing easy access and exploitation. If we look at the deep sea bed minerals, there is this UNCLOS and the law of the sea, which says that not just with respect to deep sea minerals and with respect to exploring the high seas, if there is a pirate attack, or any state can board the pirate ship and arrest the pirates and take care of the problem. Now, there is this law which deals with, say India enters into another country's, another state's ship in the waters that are near to India, and they have been given the power under this to arrest people, arrest the pirates as well. Then there are straddling stock agreements. I mean, these I'm writing over here to suggest that if at all we are bothered about outer space, something similar, we were bothered about the law with respect to law of the sea, and we have created treaties to build in a check. Here also there was no international mechanism, yet we empowered the states to take interest in it and to get into the ship and arrest pirates. Similarly, there are these straddling stock agreements. Each nation can inspect the other member nation's vessels as to when there is, say, for example, 10 tons of tuna that can be caught from the seas. Now, if a state has allowed more number of people to explore and together they are collecting more than, say, that number, that specific allocation that has been made, other nations can get into and inspect the vessels of the member nations. So these kind of provisions are existing in other forms of international law, which is not there with respect to outer space, but we can have such, these are suggestive in the other areas as well. So far as transboundary property rights are concerned, we do have treaties that regulate that on basically the two principles. That's the reciprocity principle, which basically says that it will be a reciprocal arrangement. If you respect my scientists in your state, I will respect your scientists in my state. Provides an international enforcement of each nation's obligations to protect intellectual property rights through the dispute resolution bodies, which under the WTO. So there is this reciprocity principle, and dispute resolution bodies are there. Similarly, you will come across a lot of bilateral investment treaties, and all these bilateral investment treaties typically require that expropriation disputes be submitted to binding arbitration. So it is possible that we have these measures as enforcement to take care of the enforcement problem. So far as national property restrictions on national property rights. Now, here it has been less successful because more so that the states have their own self-interest, and they wouldn't apply norms against their own self-interest. For example, as I was telling you just some time back, Singapore has, if you visit Singapore, there's a lot of sale of tiger parts or small objects that use the tooth and some ornaments made out of it. Now, Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species is there, and also the states are bound to observe it. But we still find that it would go against their own self-interest of trade and collection of revenues, that the states would not be interested in employing it. So there we have a difficulty, right? So far as human right to property is concerned, it involves a conflict between interests of nations and those of its citizens. So how can a citizen himself enforce international law against the state in the state courts? That's a pretty difficult situation to be in. As a citizen of a state, I want to file a case against the state using the international law. Now, the Rodrigues report had suggested that the right to property should be enforced only at the international, could be enforced, and it's absolutely difficult to do that. And if you look at this particular case, where the High Court of Tanzania invalidated a doctrine of customary law that female members of the Haya tribe had no power to sell land, but only the male members did. We have something similar in Madhukishwar's case in India. So human right to property, when we are trying to enforce it in our own states, what is the force of that international law? In India, in most cases, the Supreme Court has brought in through the doctrine of unenumerated rights and read those rights in Article 21, by virtue of which in India, fairly a lot of international law with respect to human right to property has been enforced. But this difficulty remains still in most other states. Now, to conclude, to me, it looks like an international property law is not just a developing field, it is actually got a lot of content in it. It's just waiting for recognition as a separate subject and then flying from there. There are these areas which are not covered, and and we need to think on these. Do we have property rights in the following? If fishes move from the high, from that 200, within the 200 nautical miles, they swim away into the high seas and then come back. Okay, we have laws with respect to them. Similarly, there are treaties which regulate about the migratory birds. So from Africa, if birds are flying all the way to India, there would be treaties that would protect that when the migratory birds come into India, we are not supposed to, the laws will ensure that they are not poached, or they are not the environment is sufficiently given so that it is not harmful to these birds, right? So similar treaties you will find between US and UK as well. So there is property law that regulates migratory birds. Cryptocurrency is a new challenge, completely existing in the virtual world. There is no international regulation as such today, but you do find a lot of states regulating and imposing taxes, treating them as stocks. And yes, national laws or state laws in certain, not in all countries, regulates the subject matter, but there might be an international regulation soon coming up with respect to that. Not just that, take up another example, the genetic composition of the humanity. If you would be reading about genetic engineering, then you will come across these two concepts of somatic cell and germline engineering. By genetic engineering, you may tamper with the gene of one individual, or you may end up tampering with the genes of the rest of the humanity. So, in case that happens, then you'll be interfering with the genetic composition of the whole humanity, which presents a lot of diversity today. Just like we protect biodiversity, similarly, genetic composition diversity that is there also would then acquire property value and would be asking for, calling for a protection of that. Wouldn't that also then be a part of international property law? To me, it is. And I'm on my way to draft a new course on international property law. How about you? Thank you so much. I would love to have your feedback. This is my email ID. Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope you loved the session and it has been able to generate some interest in international property law. Thank you.